But eventually, in thinking about publishing over the years, he settled on the idea of something that you could carry in your pocket. This is a hunting shirt. This is not a hunting vest, so there's no inner pocket. There would be if it were a hunting vest for bullets and things like that. It's also a good place. I guess I left my hunting vest on the disco floor last night. But it's also, there's usually an inner pocket for carrying bullets or words. And he liked the idea of a vest pocket edition. This is not something new to Paulet. There have been vest pocket editions of poetry for hundreds of years. And as you know, Philemon Getty's poetry series is called Pocket Poets. The idea that you could put poetry in your pocket, walk around, read it when you had time. That's the same ambition for this series. And it took him a few decades to think about it, and think about a way of doing it cheaply, and also doing it unofficially. He felt that was something important. He was a poetry booster, but disdained institutional support. His idea was to make something by hand, the same way he made his walking sticks by hand. And to produce poetry by hand was important to him. So he tried to figure out a way to publish poetry in as cheap and handy way as possible, and came up with this idea. This is kind of a cheap version. The real version, we have an American paper size called Beagle, which is slightly longer than an A4 and narrower. So it's one piece of paper, folded twice, like that. He used good quality paper, which he got from printers. It was printers' excess stock, so the paper was cheap. And the printing was not cheap, but not unreasonable either. He started, and his impetus for this was actually the idea of samizdat printing from Central Europe, from occupied countries. And he liked the idea of unofficial publication. He also liked the interest that such publications evoke in people. Professor Yashik was talking about how the Jazz Club would print 9,999 copies, and then within a week or two, the circulation would have tripled or quadrupled. And he had that same approach to poetry, that it should be something passed on, passed around. This is how Hardy passed around in format. Take a look. This is for you. Take a look at the index. He published over a period of 13 years, 100 editions of this, and it's impressive, I have to say. If you look at the names there, there are some of the names that Maureen mentioned today. Jennifer Moxley is there. Nicole Broussard is there as well. Lots of other names, and I want to talk a little bit about that. One of the things I like about the series is that it's kind of underground, and that there's no ISBN for any of these. They're not, you won't find them in the Library of Congress. They're completely off the map in terms of official publications. Yeah, that's one major thing I want to say. The first book he published was his own, this Sunflower Sutras. This was the first one in the bestseller in terms of the series. He published originally 300 copies and published 300 more, which is good. The other thing I wanted to say is about how this thing worked, how this subscription series worked. If you look at the bottom of the front page here, you have the National Poetry Foundation website information. National Poetry Foundation is located at the University of Maine, and some of you may be aware of it. If you're not aware of it, we started in the 1970s by Professor Carol Terrell, who had also been thinking about this idea for a decade. He was impressed by Robert Frost's speech at the inauguration, or reading at the inauguration of President Kennedy, and thought, poetry has arrived, we have to do something about it. Professor Terrell is also a Pound scholar, so they published a Journal of Pound Studies, Paiyuma, which now has become to embrace modern poetry in general. So the National Poetry Foundation in Orono, Maine is a center for modern poetry research, discussion. They have excellent summer workshops and conferences on American poets. So check out that website and look into their activities. I think that you people here who are here for the Rainbow of American Poetry would really benefit by increased awareness of the National Poetry Foundation in Maine. I mention that because Sylvester worked there part-time. He also disdained the academia. He works as a part-time lecturer at the University of Maine and works as a part-time proofreader at the National Poetry Foundation, which enabled him to have the world's best mailing list, because the National Poetry Foundation in Maine had the home addresses of all really good modern poets and scholars. So his mailing list for his first edition of poems were the people you find inside later on. They responded to his format and started sending him poems, which he published in the series. It really is a who's who, not only American poetry, it's also poetry in translation. I don't want to speak too much about poetry in translation because I'm speaking mostly to a group of Europeans, so you realize how important that is. I think most Americans don't realize how important that is, and a significant number of that 100 issues is poetry in translation. Curiously enough, the most represented language in translation in this series was Czech. That came about by his meeting with Petr Mikeš, who was mentioned yesterday by Professor Gaja. He should be here, but he's not feeling well, unfortunately. He met Sylvester Paulet and me in 1990, and it was quite an interesting meeting. We talked about poetry for a long time. And Petr Mikeš brought with him some of his Texty Přátel, his summed up publication, which really made Sylvester enthusiastic about doing something similar. So that Czech connection was another key jumpstart for Sylvester to do his backwards broadsides. A couple other things I want to mention in general about the series is that because the format, it allows some flexibility. You can have a long poem, as you can see here, and you can also use the panels for various effects. So this is Ann Tardos, from Ann Tardos' backwards broadside. It's called Writing. So this is analphabetical writing. The format lends itself to experimentation. Here's another one by Mark Melnikov. It's called Foreign Policy, where he's taken a book on foreign policy and made these interesting graphic crossouts, but also the circled words become a poem in itself. So there's a trend there of experimental poetry. There's also, I think, which may be probably these days the most interesting thing is his focus on poets of the older generation. More than half the poets in the series were born before the Second World War, and at the same age as Sylvester Paulet, they share a generation, and they also share a sense of sensibilities. But I think what would be interesting to you is that the number of major poets in this series is huge, 29 of them at least are in the Dictionary of Literary Biography, but these are people we haven't heard from in a long time. They're in American anthologies, but they're not published anymore. You get someone like Amiri Baraka, who in the 1980s is publishing summed-up poetry himself. No one will touch him. This is the kind of thing we would pass out at readings. Homemade, very crude Xerox, probably made by someone in his family, which is a shame. And there's other poets like that on the list. Karl Lukosi, who is in his 90s, has one of the more interesting pieces in the backwards broadsides. It's a series of Hebrew poems which have been secularized by him. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there by people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I think that hindsight will, I think, pay more attention to these poets because this is one of their few venues for publishing at this point. What's also happening is the time of the series, 1994 to 2006, matches the advent of the internet. So you have this rapid electronic communication, but at the same time, Sylvester's focus on handmade private communication. This is envelope size, and so he would hand address each envelope to every subscriber on his list and mail them. Colossal amount of time involved in doing that by hand. But the effect of it is something completely opposed to the internet. You get this in your mailbox, hand addressed to you. You open it, you carry it around with you in your pocket or purse for weeks, if you'd like, and you have time to think about it, which is something that we don't do on the internet. We read something, we click, and we move on. And so I think that he was consciously doing something that was handmade and old-fashioned, but more and more important in this electronic age. And if you want more, I know time's up, buy the damn book. That was probably.
She also publishes her translations of Marianne Moore's poetry in the journals, and today her talk will be on Marianne Moore and her employment of unpoetic material in the poetic structure.
Thank you. I'm afraid. I'm not sure if there's enough copies, so could you just share, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to say a couple of words on Marianne Moore, and she was a famous poet and well-established poet, so I suppose there's no need to talk about her, but I want to focus on the famous strategy of using quotations and particularly notes, endnotes, annotating her poetry. I will, the handout I passed is one of the most famous poems, An Octopus. And I copied the notes to it, so at the end of the handout you can find the notes accompanying the poem. In her, another, perhaps best known poem, Poetry, Marianne Moore, in the full version of it, there are several versions, in the full version, she challenges Tolstoy's claim that poetry is from his letter. He says, poetry is everything with the exception of business documents and school books. And in her poem and in her work, more seems to suggest that she says in this poem, it is not valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. So I would like to have a look at her explorations of the thin and blurred boundaries of poetry by introducing exactly business documents and school books into poetry, by working texts and methods which are normally considered extra literary and unpoetic. And of course the most obvious of these strategies is her use of quotations. Some of her poems are basically collages of quotations, some of them attributed, some of them not. And most of these quotations are actually taken not from literature, from the canon, like you highlighted T.S. Eliot, for example, but from outside realm of literature. And the other practice is her appending endnotes to her poems, which is this strategy itself does not belong to poetry. You rarely find notes in poetry to endnotes, and it's more a strategy of scientific writing or scholarly writing. Of course, Morse quotations have been discussed a lot, mostly in terms of the question of poetic voice, of poetic authority. What's more, what is her voice, what's not, what does she do with authority? Can read Kristen Miller's, for example, Kristen Miller's study of that. Sort of Gregory discusses that. What I want to focus more on is really the way she approaches the borders of poetry and plays with it, moves on it, and importantly draws our attention to it. She uses lines from scientific articles, tourist guides, biographies, travel sketches, religious works, letters, even overheard conversations. If you have a look at the notes to An Octopus, the first note is that quoted lines where the source is not given are from the Department of the Interior Rules and Regulations, the National Parks Portfolio, so something which is not poetry at all. And if you continue, it's quotes from magazines, Illustrated London News, guidebooks, philosophical works, theological works. She quotes Cardinal Newman, Richard Baxter. And she takes these quotes very often quite manipulatively. She takes just a short piece of a sentence. She takes it out of the original context and makes it part of her poem. And I think that rather than entering into dialogue or polemics, which is what you often do when you quote, you enter into dialogue with the work you quote from. And she sometimes does this, but most often she actually doesn't. She rather takes the quote or the text she quotes from as a material for poetry. She cuts it, she changes it. She changes it a lot actually, and turns it into poetry. At the same time, unlike Lowell, for example, who does not attribute his quotes, she insistently, although not consistently at all, puts the quotations in quotation marks and makes them stand out as different from the original text, her text, and forcing the reader to notice it. If you have a look at the beginning of An Octopus, An Octopus of eyes, deceptively reserved and flat, it lies, in grandeur and in mass, beneath a sea of shifting snow dunes. Dots of cyclamen red and maroon on its clearly defined pseudopodia made of glass that will bend, a much-needed invention, comprising 20-eyed ice fields from 50 to 500 feet thick, of unimagined delicacy, picking periwinkles from the cracks, or killing prey with the concentric brushing rigor of the python. It hovers forward, spider fashion on its arms, misleading like lace. So the smooth flow of lines is graphically disrupted by the quotation marks. Our attention is drawn to the fact that, well, the poem is made of language. It draws our attention to the fact of the poem. But not only it is made of language, but it is made of language that has been used before. It's a recycled language, so to say, language renewed. And this time, it is renewed as poetry. It was not poetry before, perhaps. And this effect is strengthened by Morse's use of notes, which accompany her poems, and create another level of the text, moving even further in the direction from poetry towards the non-poetic. she has yet another level, her note on the notes, and her famous note on the notes. She pretends to offer an explanation, which, because it is Marianne Moore, it's a moral explanation of her decision to annotate her poetry. She says, "Since in anything I have written, there have been lines in which the chief interest is borrowed, acknowledgements seem only honest." So the apparent purpose of the note seems to be quite straightforward. She says, "I'm quoting, and I have to attribute the quote, because it's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to plagiarize." But if we look closer at the notes, we note, as critics noted before, that the issue is far less straightforward. Most of the notes do actually refer to the actual sources of the quotation used in the poem. But the quotations are often, as I said, free, altered, cut, extended. Often they're more like paraphrases, or they just move from the original source completely. In other cases, a note acknowledges the source for a line which is not marked as a quotation in the poem, like in the first lines of An Octopus, the line about glass that will bend. If you have a look at the notes, line 6, does have a note, a long one actually, and a great one. I love this one. Glass that will bend. Sir William Bell of the British Institute of Patentees has made a list of inventions which he says the world needs. Glass that will bend, a smooth road surface that will not be slippery in wet weather, a furnace that will conserve 95% of its heat, a process to make flannel unshrinkable, a noiseless aeroplane, the motor engine of 1 pound weight horsepower, methods to reduce friction, a process to extract phosphorus from vulcanized India rubber so that it can be boiled up and used again, practical ways of utilizing tides. If you read the poem, you do not notice that it actually refers to something. You have to go back to the notes. But she also does the opposite. Sometimes, quite often actually, she quotes or she marks a passage as a quotation. She puts quotation marks, but when you look back, there's no note for the passage. Again, in Octopus, the beginning of the second part, like Happy Souls in Hell, it is a quote from Richard Baxter, Saints Everlasting Rest, which she does refer to, but not in this particular line. And again, it is not unusual to come across a passage which is neither put into quotation marks nor annotated, but it is a quotation. Elizabeth Bishop, Marianne Moore's lifelong friend, complains about this actually in her memoir of Marianne Moore, where she gives a story about her telling Marianne Moore a story of her being somewhere in Maine, actually, in a hotel, meeting a bellboy carrying 2 boys, like sea boys. And Marianne Moore really liked the bellboy, the boy ball. And she used it in her poem for Crystal Clock. And there's no note, there's no quotation marks. Elizabeth Bishop was quite annoyed. Well, she mentions it in her memoir. It was not nice of Marianne not to attribute the quote because she does it all the time. She didn't hear. And it's not far from being the only case. She steals. And the inconsistencies of quoting, bordering chaos almost, do not finish here. Because she famously edited and cut her poems all the time, she, like with her poem Poetry, she cut it down to like 3 lines from a long 2-page poem. version. And she did this again and again. Because she did this cutting and editing, what happened in the later editions of her poems is that the notes become more and more independent because she cuts the poem and she does not edit the notes accordingly. So it repeatedly happens that the end note to a line remains, but the line has actually disappeared. So the notes, actually the line references to Octopus, in the notes to Octopus, do not correspond at all. If you really try to use the notes as you would in a scholarly work, it does not work. So the connection is getting looser and looser, as if the notes had a life of their own and were trying to free themselves, loosening the ties which connect them to the main text. I realized this actually when I was translating more, and I translated the poems, a few of them, and then I went on to translate the notes because I really wanted to have the notes included. And I realized that I was expecting that to be easy because I suppose, well, it's just notes to what I had just translated. But I found out that I was faced with, not with a comment, not with a secondary text actually to the primary text of the poem, but a text in its own right. Text which I think is basically capable of standing alone, creating a kind of independent poem, quite a weird poem, but nevertheless. What adds to this is the long notes, like the one I just quoted on Glass That Will Bend. She has a whole lot of passages in her notes. In Octopus, there's another one, another longer quote about for lines 29, 62, 80, 112, 116, 195. My old pecker, Bill Pito, would give one or two nervous yanks at the fringe and tear off the longer pieces, so that his outer trousers disappeared day by day from below upwards. He usually wears 2 pairs of trousers. They're funny. These passages are funny, and when you start reading, because what happens with the notes, you do not read the notes together with the text of the poem. You read the poem. And maybe in your second reading you go back to the notes, but then you actually start reading the notes. What I actually find out that I'm doing is I start reading the notes, and I even cross the line between the independent poems. I continue to read the notes for the next poem, and then only occasionally I turn pages to the beginning in front to see what the poem is. So actually I'm doing it the other way around. I read the notes and I don't read the poem, I do read the poem first. But you actually more look at the poems as the references to the notes than the other way around. Yes, sorry. So, well, to just sum this up, the main effect of this method for me, I said that she takes quotes, she manipulates them and turns them into poetry. But actually, when you study it and think about it, this is not exactly what she does. What she does, rather, is that she shows that not that she creates the poetry out of something which is not poetry, but rather she points out the fact that poetry is there, it has been there all the way through in the texts which are not meant to be poetry. And it's lurking there, just waiting to be discovered. Borges says poetry is everywhere, it's just waiting there to jump at you. And so Moore seems to suggest that all language is potentially poetry, that what we're actually trying to do in language is to approach the world somehow, grasp it, which is impossible. It is impossible to grasp the world in human words. But at the same time, there are moments when it happens, and it does not have to happen in poetry. It can happen anytime. It can happen in a tourist guide. It can happen in a conversation you overhear. And these glimpses of success, these moments which happen luckily are, to use Marianne Moore's word, genuine poetry. Thank you.
Our another speaker is Stefan Galbus from Charles University in Prague and Anglo-American University in Prague. Stefan Galbus is originally from New England, where he completed his undergraduate studies, and also he learned his Master of Fine Arts in Poetry in New England College. He's currently working on his PhD under the guidance of Justin Quinn. Thank you. And the area of his interest is post-Second World War American poetry anthologies. He has also edited the anthology of Prague poems called From a Terrace in Prague, where the poems in 16 languages are included, and he is currently managing editor of Literary Journal Bob. And today he's going to talk about Robert Lowell's collection of poetry, Dolphin. And I'm happy that we can do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Very happy to be here. There will be actually some interesting echoes between my presentation and Marianne's on Marianne Moore, because I'll be talking about Robert Lowell and specifically his collection from 1973, The Dolphin. And I'd like to look back or re-examine the text through the lens of some of the more recent movements in American poetry, specifically conceptual poetry and conceptual writing. So, in the epigraph to Uncreative Writing, a treatise on the background and techniques of a style of contemporary American poetry known as conceptual writing, author Kenneth Goldsmith, one of the leading practitioners of conceptual writing, includes a quatrain by the avant-garde poet David Anton. And the quatrain is, I had always had mixed feelings about being considered a poet. If Robert Lowell is a poet, I don't want to be a poet. If Robert Frost was a poet, I don't want to be a poet. If Socrates was a poet, I'll consider it. The quotation reveals a dichotomy in the critical discourse of post-war American poetry that has been present at least since 1960, when Robert Lowell, in his National Book Award acceptance speech for his 1959 collection Life Studies, described two, quote, competing poetries in the U.S., a cooked and a raw. The style of poetry considered raw has shifted in the past 5 decades from a declamatory beat sensibility to an avant-garde based partially on the ideas of language poetry from the 70s and more recently, flarf and conceptual writing. The characteristics of the cooked style, however, have remained mostly fixed, an opposite pole formally and thematically from conceptual writing that is represented in part by Lowell, as Anton's quotation makes clear. Lowell is considered, and in many ways was, a prize-winning representative of the American poetry establishment, which in formal terms means closed poetry rather than open, formal rather than free verse, with an emphasis put on personal expression and epiphany rather than the, quote, conceptual approach of Goldsmith and others, who focus on the materiality of language and use textual appropriation as one of their primary tools. Citing what he calls, quote, a trend among younger writers, Goldsmith writes that conceptual poets, quote, boldly appropriate the work of others without citation. This technique, Goldsmith writes, represents a new approach to poetry and to language, and one that recognizes and utilizes the advancements made in recent decades by computers and digital technology. Looking farther back in literary history, the critic Marjorie Perloff has drawn connections between this current trend and the writing of Walter Benjamin, specifically the Arcades Project, among others. It is generally understood that writers who employ these techniques belong to the avant-garde rather than the academic or modernist camp of poets. As Perloff writes in the introduction to her study of the post-war avant-garde, quote, "For modernist poets from Hart Crane to Robert Lowell or Sylvia Plath and well into the present, the drive to pour one's own word was assumed to be the poet's primary mission. But as the various avant-garde movements demonstrated, there were other ways of making it new." The poems Lowell wrote for his 1973 collection, The Dolphin, however, suggest that a critical conception of Lowell as a pure descendant of the modernists is not completely accurate. For many of the poems in this collection employ substantial textual appropriation, the very method that Goldsmith and Perloff have claimed belongs to the avant-garde or to conceptual writers, in contrast to more traditional poets like Lowell. It is disingenuous to call Lowell a conceptual poet, yet his use of textual appropriation in this collection is undeniable, and I'd argue that in this book, he's essentially, his style is not as far from the avant-garde as is often thought. The texts Lowell appropriated in The Dolphin originate in letters and speeches from two women, the American writer Elizabeth Hardwick, Lowell's wife at the start of the book's composition, and the British writer Caroline Blackwood, whom he would marry by the time the book was completed. In 1970, Lowell moved to London, and while he was there, he basically separated from Hardwick, his wife, and moved in with Caroline Blackwood, with whom he would soon have a child. And he wrote the book during these years of separation. It's a collection of poems written in the loose sonnet form Lowell had employed in his collections Notebook from 1969, History, 1973, and For Lizzie and Harriet, also in 1973, so he published 3 books of poems in 1 year. Whether or not that's good or bad, I'm not sure. The book catalogs the complex relational journey undertaken by all of the individuals involved, although, of course, the emphasis is on Lowell. So Lowell's use of appropriation was very controversial. When he first began to show a manuscript to his friends, Elizabeth Bishop wrote back, again, talking about the use of quotations, as Mariana mentioned, and she wrote, "I'm sure my point is only too plain. Lizzie is not dead, etc., but there is a mixture of fact and fiction, and you have changed her letters." And she goes on. When the book was actually published, critics savaged it, but mostly on moral rather than stylistic terms. Adrienne Rich, for example, objected to what she called the, quote, "vindictive and mean-spirited inclusion of letters from Hardwick." Also, she uses the phrase "bullshit eloquence," which I appreciate. The morality of Lowell's appropriation is a separate debate and one in which Lowell did not genuinely engage. The most I could find in my research was a 1972 letter to Frank Bedart. Lowell described the alteration of the poems in the sequence and his use of quotes. He said, "Sophistry? No, not entirely." Despite the furor surrounding the book, it seemed that many of the critics failed to point out that in The Dolphin, Lowell was utilizing this technique of textual appropriation that was revolutionary for him, and whether consciously or not, allowed him to achieve some of the goals of conceptual writing, namely its goal of, quote, "reflecting rather than expressing experience," as Goldsmith has written. Essentially, there are 3 types of textual appropriation in The Dolphin that I would like to look at. The first is complete appropriation, whereby a poem consists entirely of a quotation. The second would be fused appropriation, in which Lowell composes a poem entirely himself, but connects a short quote or quotes onto his own words. And finally, multiple appropriation, in which Lowell uses quotes from multiple sources in a single poem, usually without giving the reader any indication of where the quotes come from. The Dolphin represents a radical formalism for Lowell, who would never completely abandon poetic form, but here expanded his use of the form with new techniques, which would, in recent years, come to be known as conceptual. So I'd like to look at essentially 3 different poems using these 3 techniques. The poem Communication is an example of complete appropriation, where the sonnet is in quotes. The whole sonnet is in quotes. It could be considered an unsuccessful persona poem, as it consists of a single 14-line poetic quotation, but there is no persona named, and therefore the reader has no indication of who is speaking. But Lowell's method here is one of volume rather than depth. By providing quotes from the same characters throughout the book, he allows their words to create their own personas. Also, by providing these quotations without lengthy descriptions of the character who has spoken them, Lowell reflects rather than expresses, to use Goldsmith terms, the emotional vicissitudes that are his subject. At the same time, Lowell allows his characters to speak for themselves, and thus the characters, while they don't necessarily become well-rounded, are immediately presented to the reader in a form that is, as Lowell wrote, quote, real beyond my invention. Because of Lowell's active curatorial role in writing the book, as you read through, you see that he's taking the quotes from letters, putting them into a loose blank verse line, so clearly he's working very actively with the language. So because of this active curatorial role in writing the book, one might be tempted to say that The Dolphin complies with the traditional modernist use of multiple voices and narrative disjunction rather than the methods of conceptual writing. But Lowell's curation does not actually contradict the methods of conceptual writers. Perloff, for example, has pointed out that even in a keystone conceptual text such as Goldsmith's book Traffic, which is supposedly a transcription of 24 hours of an AM radio station's New York traffic reports every 10 minutes, enough authorial intervention is evident that the text, that writing the book was, as Perloff says, quote, hardly passive recycling. This is also the case with The Dolphin. Unlike Goldsmith, however, Lowell never denied changing his source texts. As he wrote in a March 28, 1972 letter to Elizabeth Bishop, I could say the letters are cut, doctored, part fiction. I thought of it. I attribute things to Lizzie I made up or that were said by someone else. I combed out abuse, hysteria, repetition. I took out the worst things written against me, of course, so as not to give myself a case and seem self-pitying. It's oddly enough a technical problem as well as a gentleman's problem. Thus, even in his use of complete appropriation, Lowell crafted the quotes he appropriated. In other methods, such as the second method, what I would call fused appropriation, even more craft is evident in the poems and how they correspond to Lowell's own words. So this type, fused appropriation, is the most common technique in The Dolphin, and it varies from complete appropriation in that a quote or series of quotes is joined, rather than having the whole poem be one quote. The Hospital suite of poems is one of the most poignant examples of fused appropriation in the collection. The first poem in part 2, called Voices, feels especially personal as the emotions are more coherent and unabated than in many of their other poems in the collection. The first 13 lines of Voices come from Hardwick and paint a harrowing picture of Lowell's problematic year in and out of hospital after an attack of mania. We see the intimacy of the couple, their shared past, and also the ease, clarity, and frankness of conversation that shared past affords them. One of the closing lines from Hardwick, quote, "Tell us why in the name of Jesus," Lowell has left them. Asking for an explanation of Lowell's behavior is certainly one of the most plaintive lines in the entire collection, and the final images of all that Lowell has left behind in America are particularly striking, and these images are in these 3 lines from Hardwick in a letter to Lowell. "You left 2 houses and 2,000 books, a work barn by the ocean, and 2 slaves to kneel and wait upon you hand and foot." The poem is notable not only for the emotional qualities of these lines and images, but also for the way Lowell organically grows the poem out of them. Another poem cycle, Exorcism, is especially complex. Consisting of 2 poems, it contains a swirl of appropriated quotations with no context whatsoever, resulting in 2 sonnets that are so difficult to comprehend they seem to mirror the, quote, witchery bitchery of kindergarten winters described in the second poem. Both poems take place in winter, yet it is unclear where they are set. We find the narrator apparently reading mail and feeling small, quote, as the bridal fury shows white teeth. The quotations are words of passionate blame from Hardwick, or an exorcism as Lowell calls it. The first 3 quotations are spaced throughout the poem in a kind of call and response, an effect that owes to the echoed phrasing of the quotes, as well as the placement of the quotes in these lines moving from left to right and back again. As with most of Lowell's appropriated quotes, even when they are somewhat confounding because it is unclear who is speaking, they function as emotional symbolism, conveying a mood and a feeling. Again, getting back to this idea that Goldsmith proposes what appropriated language can do. And the final lines, or the opening and closing lines of the poem are are as follows. What we love we are, that's in italics as a quote. As November hardens the morning hoarfrost, I grow small. Slowly the bridal fury shows white teeth. And then the poem ends, you point your finger, what you love you are. Again, a quote. In the second poem in this cycle, we get as explicit an explanation of the narrator's dilemma as anywhere else in the book. Quote, one man, two women, the common novel plot. But the final 3 lines of the poem move back into appropriation, giving Hardwick the final excoriating word and leaving the poem hanging off an emotional cliff. The final 3 lines. 5, 3, okay. You can't carry your talent with you like a suitcase. Don't you dare nail us the love your life denies. Do you really know what you have done? I'll move to the last example and then conclude. Multivalent appropriation is the most complex and least prevalent style of appropriation in the Dolphin. The best example of this type of appropriation is the couple, which utilizes direct speech, a quotation within direct speech, and indirect speech. The narrator relates a dream he had about one woman, most likely Hardwick, and the final line, you did not exist, refers to Blackwood, his listener in this conversation, who also poses several questions throughout the poem. Like most of the appropriated language in the book, the lines here are not cited, other than the phrase you ask, though who you is not made clear. It is clear, however, that both Hardwick and Blackwood's language has been tampered with, as the quotations here are so lyrical, so metrically sound, that they bear Lowell's fingerprints. And a quote here. Here's how the poem opens. This is all in quotes, and then there are paraphrases and quotes throughout. Twice in the past 2 weeks, I think I met Lizzie in the recurrent dream. We were out walking. What sort of street, you ask? Fair or London? It was our own street. And just to give you one of the, I think, most controversial uses here, I'll just read a few lines, the closing lines from another poem called Green Sore, and then move on to the conclusion. So this poem has really, it talks about Lowell leaving his house in outside of London and getting the train to go to London. And then suddenly at the end of the poem, the last 5 lines of the poem are a quote, a letter from Hardwick. Dear Caroline, Lowell's current wife, I have told Harriet that you are having a baby by her father. She knows she will seldom see him. The physical presence or absence is the thing, a letter left in a page of a book and lost. In conclusion, what might be the biggest difference between the Dolphin and a conceptual text is that Lowell doesn't tell us explicitly where his quotes come from, while most conceptual poets clearly identify their sources as a key part of each book's concept and purpose, which is to pose an idea that is more important than its text. As Goldsmith has said, the best thing about conceptual poetry is that it doesn't need to be read. Lowell was not quite there. Certainly Lowell wanted this book to be read and for it to have an emotional rather than purely intellectual effect on his readers. And here there's Helen Vendler tells a story of walking across Harvard Yard with Lowell and talking about the critiques of the Dolphin, and he said, why doesn't anyone ever say what I want them to say? And she said, what do you want them to say? And he said, that my work is heartbreaking. That the Dolphin was panned by critics was due in part to the fact that they did not yet have the vocabulary to describe what Lowell was doing, and Lowell likely didn't either. Expecting to be able to hold the poems in his collection up to the same standards and categories they had previously, or focusing on the moral questions posed by Lowell's use of appropriated language, many critics missed the fact that he was embarked on a new project here with new tools. And perhaps without knowing it, Lowell utilized methods in this book that would come to be codified in future decades as conceptual. As a lauded exemplar of the American poetry establishment, Lowell was and remains an easy target for dismissal by the avant-garde. But perhaps the easiest targets should be examined most closely. Thank you.
Assistant professor of American literature at the National and Capital Historian University in Athens. As you can see from her publications, her interests are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and she has published articles on John Ashbery, Max Ernst, Joseph Cornell, American Modernist Lit magazines. She's currently co-editing a volume entitled The Letter and the Law, Literature, Justice, and the Other, which is forthcoming with London. And she's also a co-editor of the e-journal Synthesis, which is a new interdisciplinary journal of literature and culture. And today, Magda is going to talk about effect and contingency, and the open form in the poetry of the 60s and 70s in the United States.
They're not stable, so it's one point. They're nowhere near as good as your photograph. So, in Intimacy Special Issue Critical Inquiry from 1998, Lorraine Berland wrote, "To intimate is to communicate, with a spares of signs and gestures, and at its root, intimacy has the quality of eloquence and brevity. But intimacy also involves an aspiration for a narrative about something shared, a story about both oneself and others that will turn out in a particular way. Usually this story is set within zones of familiarity and conflict, friendship, the couple, and family forms, animated by expressive and emancipating kinds of love. Yet the inwardness of the intimate is met by a corresponding publicness. People consent to trust their desire for a life to institutions of intimacy, and it is hoped that the relations formed within those frames will turn out beautifully, lasting over the long duration, perhaps across generations." End quote. Lorraine Berland's mapping of the spaces and the modes of intimacy may constitute an interesting blueprint to approach a certain strand in U.S. poetry of the late 60s, a cultural moment that Fredric Jameson famously saw as marked by the waning of affect. While Jameson, as Ray Tirada has recently argued, pointed to the decline of certain modalities of experience, together with the paradigm of the white male bourgeois and heterosexual subjectivity, Andy Warhol too have dryly and ironically posited the decline of affective ties as defining his generation. And I'm quoting for the philosopher Andy Warhol, "From A to B and back again." During the 60s, I think people forgot what emotions were supposed to be, and I don't think they've ever remembered. I think that once you see emotions from a certain angle, you can never think of them as real again. That's what more or less has happened to me. I don't really know if I was ever capable of love, but after the 60s, I never thought in terms of love again. The fascination I experienced was probably very close to a certain kind of love. Against the decline of affective ties, poets who, as Daniel Kane aptly put it, created a poetics of sociability, experiment with a spares of signs and gestures, defining the communicative nature of intimacy, and as I wish to show, through minimal means and simple forms, reconfigure poetry not only as a zone of familiarity, but also as a space of desolation. While a certain familiarity and modalities of intimacy that are not necessarily tied to institutionalized forms, these points also seem to express a certain anguish for the loss of community and the dissolution of bonds. The second generation New York School, or the Lower East Side poetry scene, as the poets who were active at the time have been variously called, have been primarily defined by their intellectual affinities, close friendships, and collaborations in a moment that was marked by the critique of boundaries as well as by artistic strategies of disassociation rather than strategies of association and integration. In what follows, I want to explore how for all their bonds and affinities, much poetry of the late 60s also involves connectedness and at the same time inflects modes of privacy that speak of a certain disaffectedness and loss of connection. Either way, the workings of intimacy are integral to strongly personal open forms that inflect their tenors in a minor key. I will take my point of departure, Gerard Malanga's Warhol Associate, which circulates a poem for the poet Leonard Cohen of Montreal from the Black Sparrow 1970, 10 poems for 10 poets. Against the grain of Warhol's cluttering his autobiography with his philosophy, with memories, experiences, observations, aphorisms, anecdotes, gossips, with a detached and big irony, one might say even indifference, Malanga affectionately offers poems to poets, one of the most personal being the poem to Leonard Cohen. The poem's tone of intimacy with both one's self and the other is at the same time a stock-taking of the sensibility of his generation, and in fact may be said in resonance to Warhol's detachment, which I think detachment expresses in a sense more anguish than Malanga's attachment to poetry. It's interesting that in connection to Warhol's statement about love, Malanga's short collection pays a tribute to those who, as he puts it, will love in the name of poetry. That's in the poem. The poem is as much of a dialogue with Malanga himself as it is with Leonard Cohen. Its tonality of intimacy rests with the poet's unfolding of his own personal collection of poetry and simply on the expression of his own feelings for poetry. Now, apart from the date in 15 November 1968, this poem does not contain too many references to names, places, incidents that, for instance, in much work of the second generation New York School, seem to be paradoxically inviting and at the same time sealing off the reader outside the poet's communities. Malanga does not pin down specific experiences, but rather talks about his sense of connection to poetry, an involvement that, as he puts it in the concluding part of the poem, becomes way too personal. Malanga presents us a sensibility that is concurrently depleted and cluttered, and maybe the local personal feeling of ennui that he evokes in the opening part of the poem seems to be stemming from the fact that, as he puts it towards the end, sometimes I feel I know too much about poetry to be a poet, end quote. If feeling, however, comes in the way of creativity, so does detachment, and this interplay, I think, informs much poetry of the time. In any case, this offering of a poem to another poet as a web of feelings and anxiety, coupled with the certainty that he himself is an index of names and events that will not go unnoticed, conveys the urgency of feelings and the anxiety for connectedness. Interweaving life and poetry is yet again becoming a requisite for experience, and Malanga's poem is a testimony and a manifestation of feelings that expresses a longing for immediacy rather than mediation, and the ironic distancing that performance over being, and I quote, involves, that performance over being is seen to be defining Frank O'Hara's poetry by Drew Mill in a recent issue of Textual Practice on the Affect. It seems that there is a line to be drawn between the, I quote, theater of affects in O'Hara and the attempt to present the instability of feelings as the substance of experience and as a way to preserve one's own privacy. In Malanga's poems for poets, intimacy and the expression of attachments are deployed as a means to preserve a range of affects and emotions, and not as a space where the private gets mediated by public utterances, or making the poem, turning the poem into a stage where the personal is intended to be publicly shared. The attentiveness to the minutiae of everyday life marks the second generation New York School's distance from poetic and artistic experiments that at the time related individual existence and expression to wider cultural representations. In fact, in a cultural moment that saw the emergence of feminist, minority, performance art, and poetics, when artists precisely work against prevailing cultural codes, the idiosyncratically personal, contingent, and ordinary sits uneasily alongside explicitly politicized and public forms of art. Reading the early work of figures as diverse as Malanga, Anne Waldman, Ted Bergen, Kudrescu, Bernadette Mayer, against the backdrop of the affective third in the field of theory, invites reflection on how the turn to the contingent and the commonplace, or the intractable, stubborn particularity of personal experience, suggests a commonality of experience that is either too predictable and mundane, or a way into the sense of disaffection of the cultural moment. I think that the random, casual, and seemingly unprocessed character of these poems does involve not only private references, but also emotional states that seem to absorb collective states of anxiety. I will read a playful poem by Joe Brainerd, an artist who also wrote quite a lot and worked closely with poets of his generation. And here is Fear. A good life should be lived without fear. On the other hand, trying not to be afraid of something you're afraid of is stupid. Avoiding fear is no good. The only solution is to give in to fear and then try to overcome it. Nothing can be understood from a distance. And nothing, of course, can be understood until it is understood. Okay. Only by not being afraid of the lion, but of the fear in you that makes you afraid of the lion, can fear be overcome. In this area, I am a total flop. So, throughout Brainerd's writing, what I think we can observe is how shared or feigned emotions become a testing ground for difficulty or indifference to draw a boundary between parity and the expression of interiority and personal experience. In pieces like this, where does the circularity, self-evident, childlike, and tautological expression take us beyond a reminiscence of Stein's playful repetitions? I think that the poem, and now intersecting with Marie, is both diagnosing just much as it becomes a symptom of a certain difficulty or resistance to cope with emotion altogether. Hence, a fear of fear, which can be read also as discreetly expressing America's fear of the war in Vietnam. For all its vagueness, the poem is markedly personal and seems to discourage readers to connect to anything beyond the poem's immediate and contingent context, that is, the insignificant and unrecorded moment that caused the writing. I will move on. Malanga's and Brainerd's writings are maybe two minor instances that nonetheless suggest questions that the work of more major figures of the second generation New York school, like Bergen, Waldman, Mayer, and Kudrescu, also raise in different ways. How effectively does this prosaic, casual openness, which seems to abandon the ontological and the epistemological stakes of Olson's open fields, state something about existence, experience, and poetry, or the early 1970s charged cultural context? What do such minor forms of expression seek to assert? Themselves, their community, their connections with others, their distance from their times. Do they seek to express themselves dispassionately and assert their proximity as a way of marking off their distance from the hard realities of politics and culture? Ted Bergen's and Anne Waldman's collaboration, Memorial Day of 1971, invites reflections on similar questions too. Consisting in an explicitly imitative mode of O'Hara's I do this, I do that poems, Bergen and Waldman bend O'Hara's trope and record a series of thoughts, incidents, anecdotes in a fragmented manner that revolves themes that recur in O'Hara's poetry too. The public is becoming private, the private is being openly expressed and made public, albeit to a small community of fellow poets, artists, and readers. What the poem seemed to primarily experiment with is precisely the nature of privacy and the poetry as a doubly private and public act that revolves in an eclectic and at the same time consistent manner disparate and diverse things, mundane incidents, fears, anxieties, memories, attachments, experiences of varying import in the form of lists that may either seem as a lasting tribute to Whitman or as an experiment with seriality and randomness in line with the early experiments of Vito Acconci and Mayer. Throughout their mimeograph of Memorial Day, what would have been delegated to the level of the insignificant and the unimportant appears alongside more deep-seated anxieties, and the most intractable being the fear of death. The book opens with the poets stating the need for communication. That's the one. Their need for writing as an intimate, private space, a space that is also populated by sort of the spirituality of death, or we may see it as a tribute to undefined dead ones. This is quite a long way from Frank O'Hara's Memorial Day 1950, which was essentially a mapping of his own, which was strongly personal, but also an affiliative gesture for the historical avant-garde. Throughout the poem is brimming with intertextual allusions to O'Hara nonetheless. To name just one instance, I think you may all remember O'Hara's I wonder what poets in Ghana are doing these days in a step away from them, which becomes I wonder what the dead people are doing today. Throughout, Berrigan's and Waldman's Memorial Day remains willfully indeterminate, or to the contrary, at times too specific, more meditative, as biological parts, found language, lists of words, syntactical variations of different sorts are coupled with incidents and citations from their friends' work. Just to mention, I've heard the dead, the city dead, the devils that surround us never die, the New York City devil inside us, alive all the time, he said, tomorrow you die. I woke up, as he tied that down, girl for someone else, and white walked by, and then so did I. And that's, in a sense, the movement of the poem. Today, and those two instances, for instance, dear Mr. Postman, please take this from me to me. I'm delivered without a hitch to myself. On the page opposite. Today was a day to remember death. I remember the death of Hitler, and now I think of the song of, I can't really sing, of Roland, Holland's death, and now I think to see if there were similarities, and I see there were. And now I wonder what Tom Clark thinks, Edwin, Alex, Jake, Mike, their own fellow poets and friends. In any case, I think that what the poem conveys is anxiety. But unlike Frank O'Hara, Berrigan and Waldman cannot pin down their anxiety, cannot relate it to anything specific. As for death, it takes on various guises, from the most mundane to the most terrifying, presented in such an accretion that emotion seems to be either aborted or held at bay. The ground for intimacy in Berrigan's and Waldman's Memorial Day is the unstated reciprocity between the two poets. They care for one another, and this creates the affective space where the poem begins to open out onto the reader. We're almost done. Okay. Throughout, shared intimacy and the community of feeling between the two poets is disrupted by moments where emotion is laid bare, with a detached and at the same time poignant cynicism. I'm just going to quote one more moment. As at the moment in which they report an incident from Mayer's life, an incident where O'Hara's manner comes to intersect with purpose. X died and John knew but didn't want to have to tell anyone. Bernadette had to arrange her mother's funeral at age 15. Anyway, at least 3 a.m. and she's telling me how her father died before that. And all the death around her surround her. Then she sent me just a report of this 2 days later. Death causes tuberculosis, syphilis, dysentery, scarlet fever, and carry the written on your own. So the point gets even more personal towards the end, when Bergen and Waldman cite lines from Codrescu, and then elliptically come to reflect on transience in life. From the repetition of the word death to the repetition of the word closed, the repetition seems to be vested with anxiety, and for all the improvisatory quality of the poem, death gives way to a sense of a dead end. Death gives way to a sense of a dead end and closure rather than closeness. Throughout Memorial Day, I think what Waldman and Bergen do, they seem to be operating a deeper amount of emotion. Just a few things about Codrescu for his first collection of poems, License to Carry a Gun, where Codrescu is assembling a private and a cultural self, constructing a web of associations and images reminiscent of the early days of French surrealism. In Codrescu, the personal cannot disassociate itself from cultural and historical memory, and his sense of intimacy, we don't have time for that, often is expressed through disturbing evocation of sexuality and at times violence. One more poem I wanted to look at, but it seems we don't have time, was Simple Complications from Mayer's poems, where I think conceptual play and experimentation with language coincides with an exploration of feelings, where yet again intimacy and closeness alternates with distance. Let's conclude. Intimacy is not always dialogical or inwardly confessional. It's not only directed towards objects and persons. It does not always involve an affectionate opening out to an other. It intersects with memory, imagination, as well as with irony, sarcasm, and detachment. Sometimes things that seem to be misleadingly concrete, or gestures and names that are too intimate and too direct, such as Mayer's My Face in the Country of Gavarro, or Codrescu's disturbing evocations of sexuality, seem to be establishing the ground for intimacy. Therefore, the forms that intimacy may take invite questions as to whether exposure is a defense, a moment of joy and or pain that marks distance rather than involvement. The lines of intimacy and affect that traverse much writing of the late 60s and early 70s in the wake of the first generation of the New York School inflect a range of affects, from care to reciprocity to detachment to a sense of desolation and inability or indifference towards establishing meaningful connections. These poets, by working derivatively in a way, and through their persisting in their minor keys, I do believe offer effective engagements, if not to new aesthetics, to remember Charles Alfieri's mapping of the affect in the early, in modernist and avant-garde art, but instead they state an engagement to the ordinariness of experience, inviting a reading that will be premised on establishing an intimacy not only with the text, but also with its context, and this is possibly where the political and the cultural significance of that moment resides. There was a lot more, but never mind. Thank you very much.
taking time to ask some questions. Matthew, could you start? You mentioned that there is a difference between the time when there was no internet and that reading poetry requires a certain lonely space, a certain moment. So could you elaborate on that? There is a difference. What difference does it make that we have this new media involvement in our lives to such an extent?
Okay, I'll take the next 3 hours to...
Great.
I think that we can't escape the internet. It's here, but we can't change it. And it makes for some... In terms of technology, it's a great advance. It's great for writers. Instant communication and things like translation and editing is really special. It really streamlines the process. It's a great tool. But I think that we've also lost the kind of special space that reading and contemplating poetry we used to have for that. In other words, that private time. On the other hand, I see with these digital ink e-readers, I see a lot of people reading again on trains and public means of transport, which is good, and having some space for that. So we'll see. But I think that, and it's nice, you can carry in your pocket now hundreds of volumes of poetry if you want. So that's been changing back, which is good. But I think that for the last 12, 15 years, our attention span has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller because of this. It's too hard not to take your eyes off it. It's too hard not to click on the next link and find something else that's fun. But you lose that attention span for really ruminating over someone's words, which should be carefully chosen.
So sometimes less is more?
Yeah.
You read less, but you concentrate more?
I think so.
And for Mariana, I remember the first time I read An Octopus, and I thought it was going to be another poem like The Pangolin, a poem about an octopus. And then confusion set in. I realized it wasn't about an octopus, but I wasn't sure what it was about either. And I was going back and forth in notes, looking at books, and I was wondering if you would agree, like what I feel very strongly is her use of quotation and collage and cento also makes it very uncertain what poems are about. It's hard to say what Marianne Moore's poems are about sometimes. Are they about moral questions or are they about a pangolin? And why would she title the poem An Octopus when she's very far away from the sea, this subject matter? It's deliberately leaving the reader in the first line of the poem elsewhere. So do you think there's a connection between that uncertainty of subject and use of quotation?
Sure, it also has to do with the uncertainty of the voice, like where her position is. So the quotations definitely add to the general feeling of uncertainty. Like you don't know where the text starts, her text, where it ends. You move to the notes, and it all kinds of destabilizes, desettles. So this is certainly good about the octopus topic. The quotes at the beginning about picking periwinkles, they are actually from texts about octopuses, about actual octopuses. So the poem is about a mountain. It's about many other things, but the octopus is not an octopus. It's Mount Rainier, Mount Tacoma, just near Seattle. But she actually, it does look like an octopus. The glacier actually does look like an octopus with the tentacles. So she, in order to approach the mountain, she goes through scientific articles or popular scientific articles on octopuses. But she is, not only quotations confuse the actual topic, but also the language she uses. She speaks about pseudopodia, for example. Pseudopodia do not refer to octopuses at all. Pseudopodium is something amoebas have, like cells. So quotations and more, I think, are part of her overall strategy to make all these things uncertain. You approach her concerns is the ways you approach the world, the way you grasp it, the way you not only see it, but the ways you are able to capture it. And she says this is difficult, and it's never certain what you're actually talking about. It's not certain what you read. She says, we're reading this, but it can be read as poetry. There's a lot of irony in it, too.
I just wanted to ask Stephen Delbo, I wonder if any of the critics that you have read were made the connection between Lowell and, say, T.S. Eliot, who was a kind of master of appropriation. He was, of course, the avant-garde of his time. And there's a direct line of ascent, I guess you could say, from Eliot through the fugitives there, and Alan Tate and the New Critics, in which this could certainly show a kind of connection between the earlier avant-garde and what he was doing, and not as an avant-garde, but a reference back to Eliot and his time.
Yeah, I think, looking at the use of textual appropriation in 20th century poetry, I would look at the spectrum, one side of the spectrum being Eliot and the modernists, and even Pound and the cantos, and the other side being this conceptual writing that's happening now. In the criticism, the books that I cited, they do talk about the modernists and Pound and Eliot specifically, but Lowell is really only mentioned in this dismissive way in a couple of those quotes. So I think the way that I see it is this particular book, certainly not all of Lowell's work, but this particular book being kind of a midpoint between those two spectrums. That I do think, had you asked Lowell about it, he would certainly more readily draw a connection to Eliot, draw backwards, as you're saying. Then, I mean, there was no forwards to look forward to again. So, but yeah, I think definitely the connection is there. I think it's a little bit, Lowell's use of appropriation in the Dolphin is a little bit more developed from The Wasteland, and also just the sources where he's drawing, from which he's drawing are obviously more personal. So I think the connection is there. I think he's essentially in this book moving that use of appropriation forward a bit.
I just wondered that you talked about the notes as independent, the words which they rely only on, and that they can be seen as points. And again, if you brought to my mind Eliot and his notes, which I see as integral to his poems.
Okay. Notes and Eliot are different from Moore, and I think they have a different function. The whole business of quotes. Actually, when Pound read and edited The Wasteland, he put a marginal note saying Marianne at some point. It's not quite clear whether he meant Marianne Moore, but it was Marianne Moore's strategy to use quotes, and he perhaps complained in Eliot that he uses it too much. But what Eliot does, he quotes from literature, he quotes from the canon, and he creates this this feeling of being part of some giant culture, which does not actually help too much, perhaps, but what Moore does something very different. Partly because she doesn't quote from literature primarily. And her notes, because her sources are so different, they're not homogeneous at all. I think the connections that are created, like shortcuts between completely desperately different sources, are what can be seen in terms of poetry. What poetry does very much is connecting things which are not normally seen as connected and potentially connectable. And she does this in her notes. When you read the notes, suddenly things from like different universes meet and create a new universe. I think that doesn't happen in Eliot at all.
Maybe I could ask the panel. I mean, for years and years I've been reading the novel, and once in a while I would write a short story and put a phony name on it and give it to my students and ask them, what do you think of this? Analyze this. It's not understood until it's done. Have you dabbled in the art of poetry yourselves?
I've given my students fake Ashbury poems, which I've written myself, yeah. They can't tell the difference.
I'm asking because it seems like, I mean, when you look at some of these poems, you say, well, what's the difference between prose and poetry these days? It looks like something that anybody, I mean, when you hear it read, it's different, but when you just see it, you wonder. You just wonder. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I haven't hoodwinked my students with false documents or what have you, but I do write poems, and I think one aspect of this, what makes a poet different, from maybe 30 or 40 years ago, or more traditional, kind of connects with this idea about the information cloud. And I think today more than ever, one of the poet's jobs is filtering through all this information and making connections between, from a larger source than ever before. There's more text coming at us all the time, more information coming at us all the time. So, and I think maybe part of the change in style that, why is this not prose? I think that in some ways reflects the way that language has changed. And so I agree, sometimes there isn't much difference between prose and a poem, but I think essentially some of the tasks of the poet have changed.
And that brings us back to one of the older jobs of poetry, which was mentioned earlier, was consolation. That the way you described what the poet's work is, in the middle of the information cloud, then have to filter it, and give readers perhaps a sense of being able to understand it, however momentarily. That is a huge consolation when you're barraged by text like this. Which brings us back to, like my grand aunt taking down her Tennyson from the shelf and going, we need this for ourselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean also, I think a formal poem would stand out so much today as being just incredibly old-fashioned that, it would inadvertently be avant-garde in a certain way.
Well, interestingly, A. Stallings, who just got a MacArthur grant, is the formalist, and it's been, so it seems to be coming back around in a way.
Yeah, there are always, there are some formalists in the room, I think, but there are always poets writing in every way. I think sometimes you hear about them, sometimes you don't.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about Warhol and Malanga, because their attempts to kind of depersonalize poetry and philosophy in the 1960s were interesting.
You mean Warhol in connection to Malanga?
Yeah, together, like you mentioned philosophy and Andy Warhol.
Yes. I mean, I think what's interesting about, at least what they're completing this work, right? It's the personal element that comes into it. The non-committal, seemingly non-committal, apolitical character, but also the platonic, the contingent. My work is mostly Lyric avant-garde is surrealism, so Stella Cornell, Nathaniel Ashby, Diego Hart. And I mean, to respond to your question, what's poetry? Well, simply very mundanely, science. It's modern. It's got the lesser audience, It's more likely more people will read Franz than that they will ever read, John Ashby. So in that sense. And for me, poetry is more like, and that's what we're looking at. It's closer in a sense now to the visual arts in that sense. With stronger sort of, spatial sort of sound qualities. So I guess since the moment of the avant-garde, in any case, it's difficult to talk about distinction between genres. There is an element in which all forms of art, all forms of writing sort of perform and involve their own sort of process of writing or being made. So that's another thing. So to go back to what you said, I think that I like Malenga because in a sense, it was a close associate with Warhol, and it seems that he, I just think it just sort of breaks through Warhol's own sort of cynicism and irony, and I guess the kind of work I would refract with sort of lenses of each other in a sense, I guess. What comes down as like completely bad and like depleted in terms of, engagement, involvement in Warhol, sort of comes back. And people like him, so in that sense, this is really kind of all new to me. What I'm mostly interested in is the relation between artists and poets, for my mind. But what I like is those sort of, what attracted me most to those guys is those kind of polarities, sort of diagnosis and symptom, clutter and emptiness. It's those sort of terms, the way those two get into those words, which, to go back to that type of work now, you may say it's kind of unfashionable, right? It says that the white kind of thing. So, and they don't have a cause, in a sense. They don't have a cause. So, this is what you're going to see Cornell here and see all sorts of things. So I'm not really answering what you're saying because this is something that I'm exploring sort of as I go along. But to respond to your question is essentially this: how something that seems completely like mundane and sort of offhand and kind of clicky does have cultural content.
If you're going to do this with a fake thing, it is essential.
With a what?
The fake thing that you copy it so it looks exactly as if it came out of a book. Otherwise, they don't buy it.
The thing is, anything that you teach, from the century, that's exactly what it is. Even when I teach Steiner, William Carlos Williams, Spring and All, I gave him the poem, for Spring and All, which is entirely consists in found language in a sense. Everybody dies, someone dies in New York every how many minutes. The instinctive reaction is like, why should I care? Why should I bother? And that's why I mentioned care as well. It's one of the concepts, care and reciprocity are like concepts that I want to explore. And I think what you're essentially trying to do, and if art, or poetry of that sort of type matters at all, is precisely the way in which A defines your expectations of what, something is, or what you're supposed to expect at any particular moment, and the way in which, by looking at it and by being unsettled, disorientated, feeling that you've got no bearings, you lose your sense of bearings. This is where the kind of critical work, or kind of old-fashionedly sort of defamiliarizing kind of work begins. This is what I like to say to students. These are texts that invite you to think differently, to start approaching things differently. Approaching a text or art differently, that means you start approaching your own history, your own culture, all sorts of things differently. But yes, existence there is. And especially to that type of work, you say, no, I can write it, they go ahead.
Thank you very much for your questions and your comments and questions, and I think that it's time for lunch.
There's this longhouse they're pretty cool. Yeah.